The evening news was just background noise, a meaningless hum of headlines and tragedies that had nothing to do with my quiet life. I stood in my new neighbor's living room, the plastic watering can cool in my hand, methodically tending to his collection of ferns. He was an older man, Mr. Henderson, polite but distant. He'd asked for one simple favor while he was away on a business trip, and I was happy to oblige. Then, a news anchor's urgent voice cut through the calm. Breaking news in the largest financial fraud case this city has seen in decades. My head snapped toward the television screen. And there he was. A photo of my quiet, unassuming neighbor, Mr. Henderson, plastered across the screen. But it wasn't a holiday photo. It was a mugshot. The man who had asked me to water his plants was the mastermind behind a 10-year, multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. But the real gut punch came when they named his primary shell corporation, Apex Legacy Investments. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just some random criminal who happened to live next door. He was the architect of the financial ruin my own parents had blamed entirely on me. For 10 years, I was the family scapegoat, the reckless son who had lost everything. They told everyone I had gambled away the family money, that my foolishness had cost them their retirement, and my brother his inheritance. I was disowned, cut off, and left with nothing but shame. My brother David, the golden child, got a cushy job at my father's firm, a down payment for a house, and all the love I was denied. And all along, the man responsible for it all was a phantom, a faceless monster my family invented to cover their tracks. Now that monster had a name, and he lived right next door. You're probably wondering how the person who orchestrated my family's betrayal ended up living in the apartment next to mine. To understand that, you have to understand why my parents needed a scapegoat in the first place. The answer begins on my 18th birthday, with a trust fund I never knew existed, and a decision that would pit me against the people who were supposed to protect me. It was the day my mother looked me in the eye and explained that my future was meant to be a sacrifice for my brother's success. My brother David was born with a spotlight on him. I was born in his shadow. From our earliest days, the roles were set. David was the charismatic future, the one destined for greatness. He got the private tutors, the expensive sports camps, the brand new car on his 16th birthday. I was the responsible one, the practical one. My job was to be quiet, get good grades, and not cause any trouble. My parents didn't praise me for my achievements. They simply expected them. My successes were footnotes in the grand story of David's brilliance. If David got an A, the whole family went out for a steak dinner. If I got an A, my mother would nod and say, "Good. Now go help your brother with his homework." I learned early on that my purpose in the family was to be a supporting beam for the main structure, which was David. This dynamic came to a head on my 18th birthday. There was no party, no cake, just a summons to my father's study. My mother, father, and David were already seated, looking like a corporate board about to deliver a verdict. My father cleared his throat and slid a manila folder across the polished desk. "Liam," he began, his voice formal. "As you are now a legal adult, there are certain financial matters to discuss." He explained that my grandmother, my mother's mother, had left a substantial trust fund for me, $250,000. For a dizzying moment, I felt a surge of hope. It was a lifeline, a ticket to a future I could build for myself, away from David's shadow. I could go to the university of my choice, maybe even start a small business. I was free, but my freedom lasted less than a minute. "Now," my mother chimed in, her smile tight and unnatural, "your father and I have found a remarkable investment opportunity, a way to make this money grow for the entire family." David smirked from his chair, a silent, knowing accomplice. My father explained it was a high-yield private fund, guaranteed to triple our investment in just a few years. It was, he said, the key to securing David's future entry into the world of high finance. They needed my signature to transfer the full amount. It wasn't a request. It was an expectation. They weren't asking me to invest. They were telling me to hand over my inheritance. When I hesitated, my mother's face hardened. "Don't be selfish, Liam," she said, her voice laced with ice. "We are a family. Your brother's success is your success. You wouldn't want to be the one to hold him back, would you?" I was 18 years old, sitting in a room with the three people who held all the power in my world. My mother's question, "You wouldn't want to be the one to hold him back, would you?" wasn't a question at all. It was a threat, wrapped in the language of family loyalty. The hope I'd felt just minutes before curdled into a familiar, heavy resignation. My future had been shown to me only so it could be formally signed away. I picked up the pen. My hand was steady, a strange calm settling over me as I signed document after document, transferring my entire inheritance into a fund I knew nothing about, for a purpose that had nothing to do with me. As the pen scratched across the last signature line, a wave of relief washed over my parents' faces. My father clapped David on the back. "This is it, son," he beamed. "The first step to building your empire." They didn't thank me. I had simply fulfilled my function. The next few years were a study in contrasts. David was enrolled in a prestigious business school, driving a new car paid for by the family investment. He'd tell stories at dinner about his brilliant professors and the powerful connections he was making. My parents would hang on his every word, their faces glowing with pride. Meanwhile, I was at a state college, working nights at a campus library and weekends at a coffee shop to pay my rent and buy my textbooks. Whenever I asked about the investment, about the quarterly reports my father had promised, I was met with irritation. "These things take time, Liam," my father would snap. "Stop being so anxious. It's handled." My mother was worse. "Honestly, Liam, you gave the money for David. Why are you so obsessed with it? It's unbecoming." They made it clear that by asking questions, I was violating the terms of my sacrifice. Then, about 3 years later, the call came. I was in my small apartment, studying for a midterm, when my father's number flashed on my phone. His voice wasn't angry or annoyed. It was hollow, spectral. "It's gone," he whispered, the words barely audible. "Apex Legacy Investments. It was a sham, a fraud. The money is all gone." For a moment, there was just silence on the line. The life raft my grandmother had left me, the fortune my parents had wagered on my brother, had vanished into thin air. I felt a strange numbness, the shock too profound for immediate pain. But the numbness didn't last, because in the next breath, my father said something that showed me the true depth of their betrayal. "How could you have been so stupid, Liam? How could you have let this happen?" I drove to my parents' house in a daze. His question echoed in my mind, a poisonous, nonsensical accusation. How could you have let this happen? I walked in to find a scene of manufactured hysteria. My mother was weeping on the sofa, clutching a tissue. David was pacing the room, his face a mask of tragic despair. My father stood by the fireplace, his expression grim and accusatory. The moment he saw me, he pointed a trembling finger. "There he is, the one who ruined us." I was stunned into silence. I tried to speak, to remind them that this was their plan, their discovery, their decision. "But you're the ones who told me to sign," I stammered. That was all it took for the floodgates to open. My mother shot up from the couch, her grief instantly replaced by a terrifying rage. "How dare you!" she shrieked. "We trusted you with that money. We thought you were being sensible, but you were reckless. You never cared about this family, only about your inheritance." David stopped pacing and turned to me, his eyes wide with practiced betrayal. "All those times you asked about the money, Liam, you were probably gambling it on the side, weren't you? Trying to make a quick buck for yourself. You couldn't just let the experts handle it. They were rewriting history right in front of me." My cautious questions were now evidence of recklessness. Their complete control was now my total negligence. It was a perfectly executed psychological maneuver designed to transfer all guilt and consequence onto the family's designated shock absorber, me. I stood there, a 21-year-old kid, as my entire family systematically dismantled my reality. They built a prison of lies around me and cast me as its sole occupant. The final blow came from my mother. Her face was contorted with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful in its simplicity. "Your grandmother left you that money hoping you would do something good with it," she hissed. "Instead, you used it to destroy your brother's future and this family's security. I never want to see you again. Get out." My father didn't object. David just stared at the floor, the perfect picture of a wronged victim. I walked out of that house without another word. As the door clicked shut behind me, I was officially an orphan, disowned and left with nothing but the blame for a crime I didn't commit. That was the day I learned that family isn't about blood. It's about who they choose to protect. And they had chosen David. The 10 years that followed were a long, grinding lesson in survival. The story my family told was simple and effective. Their youngest son, Liam, had a gambling problem. He'd coerced them into a risky investment and lost not only his own inheritance, but a significant portion of their retirement savings as well. It was a masterpiece of a lie, painting them as benevolent victims and me as a degenerate traitor. Aunts and uncles I had known my whole life would cross the street to avoid me. The shame was a physical weight. I had to drop out of college. I moved into a cramped, dingy room in the worst part of town and took 2 jobs, one washing dishes in a greasy diner until 2 a.m., and another stocking shelves at a grocery store starting at 5 a.m. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. For the first year, I was just a ghost, an automaton going through the motions. The anger and betrayal were a constant low-grade fever. But you can't run on fever forever. One night, scrubbing a pot crusted with burnt cheese, I looked at my reflection in the stainless steel. I saw a hollowed-out stranger. And in that moment, I made a choice. I wouldn't let them be the authors of my entire life story. They had written a devastating chapter, but I would write the rest. The anger didn't disappear, but it changed. It cooled and hardened, transforming from a wildfire into a focused, blue-hot flame. It became fuel. I saved every dollar I could. I ate instant noodles and wore clothes from thrift stores. My one indulgence was a cheap, refurbished laptop and a high-speed internet connection. In the few hours between my jobs, I didn't sleep. I learned. I was always good with patterns and logic, something my family had dismissed as unimportant. I threw myself into the world of cybersecurity and forensic accounting. I took free online courses, read every digital textbook I could find, and practiced for hours, tracing phantom money through complex digital systems. I became obsessed with finding things that were meant to stay hidden. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about building a skill that was mine alone. It was about becoming someone who could spot a lie not just in a person's eyes, but in a line of code or a doctored ledger. While my brother was likely living a life of ease, I was in my tiny room, becoming a digital ghost hunter, training myself to find monsters like the one who had destroyed my past. My obsession paid off. After a few years of tireless work, I had built a portfolio of freelance projects that got me noticed. A small tech firm hired me as a junior analyst. Within 2 years, I was their lead investigator for digital forensics. The skills I'd honed in my tiny room were perfectly suited for untangling the digital knots of corporate fraud and data breaches. The irony was not lost on me. I was now being paid handsomely to find the kind of financial predators my parents had so blindly trusted. 5 years after that, I left to start my own cybersecurity consulting firm. The boy who was cast out for losing $250,000 was now a CEO, managing contracts worth millions. I didn't buy a sports car or a flashy watch. The first thing I bought was security. I moved into a modern, high-rise apartment building with a doorman and state-of-the-art security, a fortress of my own making. My new life was quiet, ordered, and most importantly, mine. The apartment next to mine was occupied by a polite, solitary retiree named Mr. Henderson. We'd exchange pleasantries in the hallway. He kept to himself, and I respected that. For the first time in a decade, the past felt distant, like a story that had happened to someone else. The hardened anger had cooled into a scar, a permanent part of me, but one that no longer ached with every breath. I thought I had closed that chapter for good. Then, an email arrived from a distant cousin, one of the few who had always treated me with a cautious kindness. It was an invitation to her daughter's wedding. Tucked into the email was a personal note. "I know things are complicated," she wrote, "but I wanted to let you know. Your parents are struggling. Your father's firm took a big hit a few years back. David never became the big shot they hoped. He's a mid-level manager at a regional bank, buried in debt from the student loans he took out after. The news didn't bring me joy. It brought a strange, cold clarity. Their grand plan had failed on its own terms. Even with me as the scapegoat, David hadn't soared. Their dream had been built on a rotten foundation from the start. I deleted the email and felt nothing. A week later, Mr. Henderson knocked on my door. He was going on a trip, he explained, and his regular plant sitter was unavailable. He offered me $100 just to come in and water his ferns every other day. It was a simple, neighborly request. I agreed without a second thought. And that is how I ended up in his apartment, watching the evening news, as his face appeared on the screen under the headline, "Mastermind of Apex Legacy Ponzi Scheme Arrested." I stood frozen in Mr. Henderson's living room, the plastic watering can still in my hand. The news anchor's voice faded into a dull drone. It felt like the world had tilted on its axis, and the last 10 years of my life had snapped into a chilling, perfect alignment. The phantom who haunted my past, the faceless architect of my family's great betrayal, was not a phantom at all. He was my neighbor, the man whose ferns I was watering. A cosmic joke of such staggering cruelty that it circled all the way back around to being a gift. The universe, it seemed, had a flair for the dramatic. Any lingering shock was quickly replaced by an icy, absolute calm. This was not a coincidence. This was an opportunity. My old life of waiting tables and scrubbing floors was gone. But the man it created was standing right here. The man who spent thousands of hours learning how to navigate the darkest corners of the digital world. The authorities had Henderson, the man. But I knew that men like him didn't keep their secrets, or their money, in their heads. They kept them on hard drives, in encrypted ledgers, hidden behind layers of digital camouflage. The police would follow the official paper trail. I could follow the digital breadcrumbs they wouldn't even know how to look for. The path to my vindication wasn't through a courtroom where I would be cross-examined about my gambling problem. It was right here, in this quiet, tastefully decorated apartment. My eyes scanned the room, no longer seeing it as a neighbor's home, but as a digital crime scene. And there it was, on a small desk in the corner. A sleek, high-end laptop, sleeping but still plugged in. Next to it, a small leather-bound notebook. Amateurs, I had learned, often made the same mistakes. They used complex passwords but wrote them down somewhere nearby, thinking a physical notebook was safer than a digital file. I put the watering can down and walked over to the desk. I opened the notebook. The first page was blank. The second page was blank. But on the third page, lightly indented from the pressure of a pen on a page above it that had since been torn out, was a faint impression. I tilted it to the light. It was a string of 16 alphanumeric characters. A password. I pulled a small, powerful flash drive from my keychain, a tool of my trade, loaded with data cloning software. I had a legal right to be in this apartment. The clock was ticking. I wasn't just here to water the plants anymore. I was here to dig up a decade of buried secrets. My hands didn't shake. My breathing was even. I plugged the flash drive into the laptop's USB port. The screen flickered to life, asking for the password. I typed the 16 characters I'd seen indented in the notebook. Access granted. A wave of triumph, cold and sharp, washed over me. The cloning software initialized, its progress bar a thin blue line creeping across the screen. Every sound in the hallway, a distant cough, the hum of the elevator, was magnified, but my focus was absolute. This single file, a perfect mirror of Henderson's digital life, was the key. 5 minutes later, the transfer was complete. I ejected the drive, closed the laptop, and placed the notebook back on the desk exactly as I had found it. I watered one last fern for good measure, then quietly let myself out, my heart hammering not with fear, but with anticipation. Back in my own apartment, the fortress I had built for myself, I went to work. This was my territory. I plugged the drive into my own powerful system and began to excavate. Henderson was clever, but he was also arrogant. He used nested encryption and mislabeled folders, but he kept everything. Criminals, especially white-collar ones, are often meticulous record keepers. For 48 hours, I barely moved. I lived on coffee and the cold fire of my decade-old rage. I sifted through shell corporations, offshore bank records, and thousands of emails written in careful, coded language. And then, buried in a folder labeled Client Outreach, I found it. The Master Ledger, a complete list of every investor in Apex Legacy Investments. I saw my own name, a digital ghost from the past, and then I saw the other names, dozens of them. Many were my parents' friends, colleagues from my father's firm, members of their country club. But the real discovery, the one that made the air leave my lungs, was in a separate, heavily encrypted file named Partner Commissions. It took me 6 hours to break it. It wasn't a list of investors. It was a list of recruiters, people who fed new victims into Henderson's machine in exchange for a secret kickback. There were only 5 names on the list, and the third name was my father's. Beside his name was a series of dates and figures, transfers totaling over $150,000, paid out to a numbered account in the Cayman Islands. It all became sickeningly clear. My parents hadn't just been duped. They were complicit. My father was a feeder for the Ponzi scheme. They hadn't sacrificed my inheritance out of foolishness. They had sacrificed it to grease the wheels of their own illegal side hustle. The reason they needed a scapegoat wasn't just to save face. It was to avoid a federal indictment. For a full day, I did nothing. I simply sat with the knowledge, letting it settle into my bones. The story I had told myself for 10 years was wrong. I wasn't just a scapegoat for their failure. I was the cover for their crime. My public shame was the price they paid for my father's freedom and my brother's unearned advantages. The scale of the betrayal was so immense, so absolute, that it brought a strange kind of peace. There were no more gray areas. There was no room for doubt or pity. There was only the need for a reckoning. A swift trip to the authorities with my evidence would put my father in jail, but that felt too clean. Too merciful. They had orchestrated a slow, public demolition of my life. I decided they deserved the same. My revenge would have stages. First, I would dismantle their world from the shadows. I was a ghost now, and ghosts can go anywhere. I started with my father. Using a heavily encrypted email client routed through a dozen servers across 3 continents, I drafted a message. It was a masterpiece of corporate speak, addressed to the chairman of the board at my father's firm and blind copied to the state's Financial Ethics Commission. It didn't contain accusations. It posed questions of regulatory concern. It spoke of potential exposure related to undisclosed third-party commissions and reputational risks tied to an historical investment fund currently under federal investigation. I didn't name my father. I didn't name Apex. I just planted a seed of pure poison and sent it into the wild. An internal investigation would be unavoidable. His partners, ever protective of their own money, would turn on him in a heartbeat. Next was David. I dove back into Henderson's files. It didn't take long. A wire transfer for $80,000, sent from the same Cayman Islands account directly to the bursar's office of David's prestigious business school. His education, the very foundation of his supposed superiority, was funded by fraud. I drafted a second anonymous email, this time to the compliance department of the regional bank where he worked. I attached a heavily redacted copy of the wire transfer receipt, blacking out the source but leaving the date and amount visible. I raised concerns about potential violations of the Bank Secrecy Act and an employee whose lifestyle and educational history may not align with their declared income. I was using their own language of suspicion and propriety against them. Then, I sat back. I had lit 2 long fuses. Now, all I had to do was wait for the explosions. The first tremor hit 2 weeks later. It was a small 2-paragraph story in the city's financial journal online. My father's firm had announced he was taking an extended leave of absence for personal reasons. The corporate jargon was unmistakable. He had been suspended, pending the results of the internal investigation I had triggered. He hadn't been fired yet, but he was a dead man walking. His reputation, the thing he valued above all else, was now stained. A week after that, a former colleague from David's bank sent me a message on a professional networking site. "Hey, weird question, but did you hear about your brother? He was escorted out of the building on Friday. The rumor is something about his financial disclosures." David, the golden child, the chosen one, had been publicly humiliated. Their professional lives, the twin pillars of their arrogance, were crumbling. I imagined the frantic, whispered conversations in their house, the paranoia growing like mold in the dark. They knew it was a coordinated attack, but they had no idea where it was coming from. They had spent a decade believing I was a broken, penniless failure. The idea that I could be behind this was probably too terrifying for them to comprehend. Until my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but I knew instinctively who it was. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Hello?" I said, my voice perfectly neutral. There was a shaky breath on the other end, then my mother spoke, her voice a venomous whisper. "Liam, is that you?" "It is," I replied calmly. "It's been a long time." A torrent of panicked accusations followed. "What have you done?" she hissed. "Your father is being ruined. David lost his job. Is this your doing? After all these years, you choose now to come back and destroy us?" There was no apology, no remorse, just the same selfish indignation I remembered so well. They had punched down for a decade, and the moment they got punched back, they screamed victim. I let her finish, the silence stretching after her tirade. "I have no idea what you're talking about," I said, my voice cold and flat. "I've been quite busy building a life for myself. It sounds like you have more pressing concerns than me. You reap what you sow? Isn't that what you always used to tell me?" Before she could respond, I hung up. I had given her nothing and everything all at once. The ghost she had created 10 years ago was now haunting her, and she had no idea how to fight it. The fear in her voice was the first real taste of victory I'd had, and it was delicious. My phone call with my mother had been the appetizer. Now it was time for the main course. Her panicked denial confirmed they were wounded and cornered. The final act of this tragedy needed a stage, and I had the perfect one. I sent a single, untraceable email to my father, my mother, and my brother. The subject line was simply, "Meeting." The body of the message was brief and left no room for negotiation. "We will discuss Apex Legacy Investments and my grandmother's trust. My office. Friday, 3 p.m. I have a file prepared that federal prosecutors would find very interesting. Be there." The threat was clear. Their careers were already in ashes. I was now threatening their freedom. They would come. My office is on the 45th floor of the city's tallest building. The walls are glass, offering a panoramic view of the world below. It's a space designed to communicate power, stability, and control. everything they had tried to strip from me. I had the conference room prepared. A long, black marble table, 4 chairs, and a single file folder placed precisely in the center. I didn't get up when my assistant showed them in. They entered like ghosts, pale and diminished. My father, who had always seemed like a giant in my childhood home, was stooped, his expensive suit hanging on a shrunken frame. My mother's face was a roadmap of anxiety. And David looked like what he was, a failed golden boy, his arrogance replaced by a sullen, defeated slump. They were no longer a board of directors delivering my sentence. They were defendants, awaiting theirs. They stood awkwardly for a moment, dwarfed by the scale of the room. I motioned to the chairs opposite me. "Please, sit." My voice was even, betraying no emotion. They sat down stiffly, their eyes fixed on the manila folder on the table between us, as if it were a bomb. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to stew in the atmosphere I had created. Finally, I leaned forward, my hands clasped on the table. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I simply stated a fact. "I've spent the last few weeks analyzing the digital records of a Mr. Arthur Henderson," I began, watching my father's face lose its last trace of color. "It's a fascinating case study in fraud, but the most interesting part wasn't the scheme itself. It was the list of his co-conspirators." I paused, letting the word hang in the air. "Imagine my surprise when I found your name, Father, on a list of partners who received illegal commissions." My father stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. All the bluster, all the authority he had wielded my entire life, evaporated in an instant. My mother looked at him, her expression a horrified, dawning comprehension. She hadn't known the full truth, I realized. She had only known the lie she had helped create. David, for his part, just looked small, a spectator to the demolition of the world that was built for him. My father finally broke, slumping in his chair. "How?" he whispered, his voice raspy. "How did you find that?" I tapped the manila folder. "Men like you and Mr. Henderson always leave a trail. You just have to know how to read it. You didn't just lose my inheritance. You actively recruited your friends and colleagues into a criminal enterprise for a secret payday. You used me as a human shield to cover your own felonies." My mother started to sob, a low, wretched sound. "We had to protect David," she cried. "We had already lost so much, we couldn't lose everything. We thought you were strong enough to handle it." The excuse was so pathetic, so transparently selfish, it was almost laughable. They thought I was strong, so they decided to break me. I pushed the folder across the table. "Here are your options," I said, my voice cutting through her cries. Inside that folder is a full confession, already written out. It details your role as a recruiter, the secret commissions, and the deliberate framing of your son. It also includes documents transferring ownership of your house and all remaining liquid assets to a restitution fund for the other victims of Apex. You will sign it all. In return, this specific folder detailing the kickbacks does not go to the FBI. You will be ruined, but you might just stay out of prison. That's option A. I paused. Option B is I pick up my phone and make a call. You have 60 seconds to decide. There was no decision to be made. They had no power, no leverage, no lies left to tell. My father, his hands trembling, pulled the papers from the folder. My mother watched, her face a mask of utter ruin. I slid a pen across the table. It was the same brand they had given me 10 years ago. With a shaking hand, my father signed away his house, his money, and what was left of his life. My mother signed after him. They had sacrificed their scapegoat son to protect their golden one, and in the end, they had lost it all anyway. They left my office without another word, 3 broken people walking out into a world that no longer belonged to them. I stood at my window, looking down at the city lights. The anger was gone. The cold flame was gone. In its place was a quiet, expansive peace. It was never about the money. It was about the truth. And for the first time in a decade, the truth had set me free.